The discussant is Matthew Rutledge.
Well, congratulations, folks. We're just about there. Just hang in here for a few more slides. We can talk about a paper that I think we're really ending on here on a nice note. I think it was a very exciting, innovative paper. I'm happy I had the opportunity to read it, and I'm excited about the opportunity to use some of these measures actually in some of our own future research. This is just something that's available in the HRS, so I would encourage you to be considering it yourself. What's nice about this paper is that it's really providing us an opportunity to think about things besides finances and health, which is where we tend to look. I think it's a little bit of a lamppost effect. When we're thinking about the effect of the things that are causing us to retire, we tend to focus on those things that are easy to measure. Things like how much wealth you have, or the Social Security benefit incentives, or actually not just money here, but also health. But we know that we just as people that live in the world that there's more to these decisions than just the stuff that is easily measured. And so I'm going to use my discussant prerogative here and talk a little bit about one of my own papers, but I'm actually going to cast it in a little bit of a negative light, just because we really looked at trying to explain every possible reason why people would be retiring earlier than they planned. We find that about 37% of people retire earlier than they had planned, according to earlier estimates that they provided in the HRS. Job loss and health status are big important deals there. But really, all the observable characteristics we could come up with really only explained something about like 1/4 of this increase in this earlier than planned retirement. So what's left? Well, clearly a lot of idiosyncratic, maybe hard to measure, very subjective things that are clearly big parts of people's lives. Things like job and life satisfaction, quality of leisure. And this paper, Marco very well explained here, is focusing on another aspect of that, specifically work-life balance. So he's got a couple of really nice, unique HRS measures. One is how does work interfere with life? And then the opposite, how does life interfere with work? And just being able to try to suss out when we know that work-life balance is probably pretty important, which direction is it going in? So it's nice to be able to look at both of those at the same time. So they're going to look at the transitions from full-time to part-time, from full-time to retirement, and also part-time to retirement. And what I think is really cool about this paper is not just stopping there and thinking about the importance of work-life balance, but also how does work-life balance interact with other aspects of your life that you have to worry about when you're trying to make your retirement decisions, specifically the spousal health shock. In the paper, it's talking about how work-life balance may mediate the spousal health shock's effect on work. I'm going to try to describe it a little bit differently just because, as Marco was explaining, the measures that they have for work-life balance are actually negative measures. The bigger work-life interference that means you have less work-life balance. So that means that what we're actually looking for is a bigger effect of these work-life interferences on how spousal health shocks affect your decision to retire. So we're actually, even though it says mediate, I think we're actually trying to look for a bigger interaction effect, which is a little bit hard to understand. So I'm just going to try to explain the story just so that we're all on the same page, then we'll talk about some of the policy implications. The story, I think, is when work is interfering in your life, I think that makes it difficult for you to justify staying in the workforce. Not only are you looking forward to the potential leisure that is awaiting you once you get to retirement, you're also looking forward to not having that thing in the back of your head that gets in the way a little bit of your enjoyment because you know that you have work to come back to at some point. And so the more that that's true, I think the harder it is for people to stay in the workforce, to justify keep working. When the spouse gets sick, that means you may want to reprioritize and really sort of take away all of those other things that are weighing on you, all those other factors. From the opposite perspective, when life is interfering with work, I think it makes it just hard to keep working, even if you want to. And then if the spouse gets sick, I think it becomes even harder to hold on to that job. That's yet another way in which life is interfering with work. They don't actually address that last bullet point so much in the paper. I think it's potentially because you probably tried it and it didn't really come out much. That's kind of what I figured. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why that might be the case, why we may not be seeing any sort of effect in a little bit. Just to talk first about their findings, first off, when work affects life, that means that workers are more likely to retire. Retirement happens a little sooner, and that's especially true for women, where women are seeing, women who have higher work-life interference, work-to-life interference, sorry to make the causal direction clear, they're going to be more likely to transition from full-time to retirement or from part-time to retirement. For men, that mostly just happens among part-timers. They're just moving from part-time to retirement. Really not a whole lot going on for the full-timers. there really doesn't seem to be much evidence that life-to-work interference actually has much effect on these transitions, and we'll talk about why in a second. And again, what I think is the innovative part of this is this interaction with the spousal health status. When work affects life, women especially adjust more after that spousal health shock. So when work-life interference, that measure is high, the spousal health shock increases the full-time to part-time transitions and increases part-time to retirement. So basically everybody just moves down one level. With men, that's not really happening much, and you saw those graphs, they're all pretty much just flat. So the results really emphasize here that women are the ones that are bearing a lot of the responsibility when life intervenes around retirement age. Their results are showing that they're more sensitive to work-life balance when they're trying to decide whether to transition out of their current employment status. There's also a closer relationship among women between work-life balance and their decision to transition into one of these other employment statuses after their spouse becomes sick. I wonder, I'm not sure there were summary statistics in the table to actually show whether women are more likely to experience these sorts of spousal health shocks. Men are coming to retirement age a little bit older than women and also potentially more likely to have a health shock. So women may be facing this situation a little bit more often as well. And I think that's all consistent with some of the work that Kathleen was showing earlier, also that Claudia Golden mentioned in a really cool AEA presidential address from a few years ago that opened my eyes, that really talks about how in occupations that are just naturally more flexible, that allow you to do your work when you want to or in the environment in which you want to, the male-female wage gap is much smaller, so that women seem to be doing much better when these work-to-life or life-to-work interferences actually are allowed to be handled in a more flexible way. So now I want to talk a little bit about why we don't necessarily see much of an effect from the life-to-work interference results. And I wonder if there's maybe an offsetting effect here going on. So the story I mentioned before says that when life interferes with work, it makes it hard to work, and so you may not stay in it. But it's possible that we actually would see an effect going the other direction too. What they're looking at in their sample is a sample of workers. So clearly, even if they have a high life-to-work interference, these are people that have figured out a way to make that happen. And so just from that selection effect, it's possible that they've found some sort of coping mechanism to try to stay in the workforce. And I think that's true also when the spousal health shock happens. So even though a spousal health shock is life getting even more in the way, these high life-to-work interference folks who have actually been in the workforce this whole time may just have a better way of coping with these further life stresses. And so it's possible that they can actually stay in the workforce. Although at the same time, I wonder if there is some sort of vicious cycle here. And so I'd like to see the correlation between work-to-life interference and life-to-work interference, because you can definitely think of a story where if work is getting in the way of life, that makes it harder for you to manage your life, which will have a further effect on your ability to stay in the workforce, and then work will further get in the way of life, and so on and so forth. So I think the correlation there could actually be fairly high, and I wonder if some of the work-to-life interference that you're estimating actually might be borrowing a little bit from life-to-work interference. So now policy. I think it's a little bit difficult for me to imagine how government can help to make work interfere with life a little bit less. I think there are some pushes for regulations that might actually be working in that direction. For instance, work hour predictability is something that I know is starting to get a lot of attention. And that's definitely one way in which work would interfere with life if you are always trying to compensate for having a different number of hours in each week. Or potentially full accounting for overtime pay is a way in which you can compensate people for when work interferes with life. But I think a lot of the reforms might have to come from the employer side. And that's difficult for government policy to address, except that government policy can affect worker bargaining power, which may allow for workers to push employers to make better accommodations for some of these concerns. And it's especially difficult, I think, for government to help with work's interference with how life interferes with, or how it interacts with spousal health shocks. Paid family leave is one thing that Marco mentioned near the end that I think will be an interesting sort of effort to try to tease out some causality, but I'm not sure whether that's work-life interference or life-work interference, and so it's possible that that might not do much. I just have a couple of suggestions here. It seemed like from the description of the HRS data that it seems like they may actually be surveyed about these things more than once, and so if there's any way in which you can track how work-to-life interference or life-to-work interference changes over the last parts of of their work lives, I think that would be really interesting and maybe help tease out some of this coping mechanisms that people may be able to compensate for their life-to-work interference. And also just the fact that we have these opposite effects with very similar acronyms. I got a little bit confused a few times, but otherwise, an excellent paper and like a really great way to end this conference. Thank you.